Okay, hello everybody and welcome to Friday, May 8th. Today our class is going to work on the last piece of that people and conservation section that we did this week. So I just want to repeat this final exam announcement that I gave on Wednesday and that I also just sent you all an email about yesterday. So our final exam is Tuesday, May 19th. It's on Moodle, just like the midterm. It's a timed exam. So whenever you check it out, you have 2 hours. Just like the midterm exam, I'm going to give you 24 hours starting at 10:15 a.m. because that's our normal exam window, 10:15 to 12:15. But you can check it out anytime within the next 24 hours. And so please let me know if you have any factors that make it not possible for you to take the exam during that time period, and we can figure out something else. And then also next week, so Monday and Wednesday, I'm going to have live study sessions. So a Zoom link that I'll put on Moodle, just like the Wednesday workshop intros, and you can click on that link and you can join us in an exam study session. And I'll have the exam study guide posted as well. Okay, so if you have any questions about that, send me an email. Okay, so today's just this one video, the workshop follow-up. Figuring out solutions to some of the problems you looked at in that workshop and that we looked at on Monday. So this week, the whole idea has been this concept of moving from the idea of just protecting biodiversity to the idea of protecting biocultural diversity. So taking people and local cultures into consideration when we make conservation plans, not just as like a problem that needs to be dealt with, but as something that can potentially be a support and an advantage of these conservation programs. So on Wednesday, we defined culture, very hard to define. Those of you who've taken anthropology classes would probably be better at defining it than I would. But I refer back to this seminal paper that described it as the system of shared symbols, beliefs, behaviors, values, norms, artifacts, and institutions that the members of a society use to cope with their world and with one another, and that are transmitted from generation to generation through learning. And then we looked at this definition of biocultural diversity, which is, as you probably define it intuitively, it's defined as the total variety exhibited by the world's natural and cultural systems. And then we looked at this map on Wednesday, and this is one of many maps out there just showing overlap between cultural diversity and biological diversity. So those orangey red areas with the fuzzy edges are biological diversity hotspots, and the red dots are cultural hotspots, cultural diversity hotspots. And in this context, each culture is represented, or languages are the proxy for culture. So each red dot is a separate language. And so places where we have high language diversity, aka cultural diversity, we also have high biodiversity. You can see that on that map. So then on Wednesday, we looked at the case study, which you did for your workshop, which was biocultural diversity in the Solomon Islands. So if you look back at this map here, you can see that this region down here in the Philippines and where the Solomon Islands are is a very, very high biodiversity and cultural diversity area. And so we focused on this one piece of that, the Solomon Islands, and here's Australia if you are curious where exactly this is. And basically we went through on Wednesday that there's many endemic bird species, endemic bat species, there's huge coral reef diversity, there's reefs surrounding all the islands, and they are very important for their own diversity, but they also support many commercially valuable fish like tuna that local fishermen fish and sell to the outside market economy, but that are also really important for subsistence of peoples on the islands. So like I said, it's also a really culturally diverse place. If you use language as a proxy for a culture, then this is incredible. There's between 70 and 85 languages spoken in the Solomon Islands. And if you look back at that map, that's pretty crazy, right? Look at the size of the Solomon Islands. Between 70 and 85 languages spoken in that region. So very, very high cultural diversity. And what we talked about on Wednesday and you read in your workshop is that the system, land is managed in a way that's really different from how we manage it here. It's not traditionally owned, but access rights are owned. So you may have access rights to a particular patch of forest that were passed down to you through your family that you're allowed to log there. But since you know you're passing it down to your relatives after you, you don't want to log the whole place out, right? You could lose your rights and you also will damage the resource that belongs to your lineage. There's traditional rights to fishing areas and to farming areas as well, as you see in those pictures. So this is how land is managed and owned in the Solomon Islands. So then in your workshop, I'm not going to go through each of those questions because I just want to quickly tell you some examples of solutions. So I'm just going to go to that. I think this was the third question or the fourth. So I asked you to identify in the Solomon Islands case study some common threats to biodiversity and cultural diversity. And there were several you could have picked. You could pick mining, you could pick overfishing, but you could also pick logging. So logging in the Solomon Islands is a growing problem. That picture down there on the left shows a road being built into the forest and logging happening on either side. There's a lot of international commercial logging interests coming into the region because there's so much unlogged virgin forest. And basically, this is threatening biodiversity. That's obvious. At this point, you understand how that's threatening biodiversity. But how is it threatening cultural diversity? Well, for one thing, a lot of people in the Solomon Islands still rely on, they have a subsistence lifestyle and they rely on inherited foraging patterns from thousands and thousands of years of knowledge, like this man here hunting wild boar, or these women foraging in the forest for edible foods and flowers. And with the loss of these forests, obviously those resources will also be lost. So they're not going to be able to maintain the same cultural traditions if they don't have the same foods, the same medicines, the same materials from the forest as they traditionally have. And in addition, the logging is actually causing threats to that traditional system of land management, because here's something important I'll tell you. So think of the land that you might not own any land, but maybe your parents own the land, just the land your house is on, or maybe you have relatives who own a house with land that they own the land. How do we know they own that land? Well, they have a paper in the town hall that registers their deed to that land. It's theirs. So if somebody should come and say, I'm going to cut down all the trees at your house, Kate Cleary, I would say, no, but this is my land. Go down to town hall and get the deed. But in a lot of developing countries or places where traditional or indigenous peoples have been for a long time with traditional land management, there is no such paperwork backup. So in Western culture, we really value paperwork. If you have a piece of paper that says you own something, you own it. Whereas like historical precedent doesn't have as much weight. So one of the things in the Solomon Islands is like if multiple people have logging rights to a land, like say this area down here, and then one of them goes to the logging company and says, I would like to sell you the logging rights to my land. You can come and log on this land. The other people who have logging rights might object, but they don't have a piece of paper saying that that land belongs to them too. So what happens is, not right now, está en mi cuarto. Está en la cama en mi cuarto. So what will happen is that the logging companies will help the person who's willing to sell them the logging rights by helping them navigate the system of getting your land formally titled in the Western system. So let me just sum that all up again for clarity. One of the only ways in the Solomon Islands and many other indigenous managed lands worldwide, one of the only ways that you can get a formal Western title to your land is by selling it to a Western company or international company that really wants it, and they will help you navigate that process and get a piece of paper that says you own that land. So that's another motivation to sell the rights to your land, right? You get the money, And then you have kind of formalized the fact that you own that land before. Okay, so let's take that system of land ownership and think about it for a second. So why does that system of land ownership, how could it, I wanted you to think about in this question, how could it make conservation more difficult? How could it make conservation easier or more effective? And if you think about it, so to my mind, it comes to my mind right away, what can make it more effective? So how it could make conservation more effective. So we read about in the workshop traditional ecological knowledge. If organizations attempting to create conservation work with local people who understand the ecological systems, you can learn a lot about what's the best way to protect that resource. You know, say you want to protect part of a fishing area so that fish can breed during part of the year. Maybe you don't know when that is. Ask the local people. They definitely know what time of year the fish are spawning and what other ecological aspects might need to be taken into account to effectively protect that fish. Okay, so how could customary land tenure systems make conservation more difficult? Kind of what I already just said. Like if you are saying like, let's make this into a reserve, we'll just take your paperwork and we'll go to the government and get, you know, the equivalent of a 501c3 tax status. So you'll be a nonprofit organization. Just give me the papers and we'll do it. Well, they don't have papers. They don't have papers. The system is more community-based. Like you see in this picture down here, it's like getting together and negotiating what each person needs and what the land can withstand. Very sustainable, but not easy to translate into these Western organization systems. So this is moving now into the solutions part of it. So you didn't talk about this in your workshop. I just want to use this as a tie-up for the whole week. So community-based conservation is one potential solution to these issues. And we've heard about community-based conservation before in class. These are conservation initiatives that incorporate improvement to the lives of local people while conserving areas through facilitating the continuation of local management, excuse me, and or through the creation of national parks or wildlife refuges. So community-based conservation basically leverages culture to protect biodiversity and vice versa. And the example that we looked at earlier this week on Monday, excuse me, was this one of wildlife management areas in Tanzania. With that short film that you watched, you hopefully were able to see and identify the ways in which, instead of just having a line drawn around a reserve and telling the local people you can't go in there, that's for the wildlife, and then having wildlife come out of that reserve and trample their farmlands and croplands so that they just felt angry. Instead, they had this management system where the local people could benefit directly from protecting that wildlife, right? So the same thing is true in the Solomon Islands when these community-based conservation plans are well thought out and well articulated and implemented effectively. So in the Solomon Islands, basically, and elsewhere, what conservation agreements allow landowners to do is to recoup some of their lost potential income if they decide not to pursue commercial resource extraction. So, go back to this picture. Okay, so maybe this community here is really tempted to sell maybe they all agree that they should sell their logging rights to a company. But if a community-based conservation measure, which are usually facilitated by NGOs, sometimes the government, can come in and say to them, what if instead of that, we can come up with a system where you receive training and supports and you transform this forest into a reserve? You can continue to use it in all the ways you have used it previously, but the additional income that you're craving from the forestry company can instead come from ecotourism. So basically for the community, if the ecotourism piece works out, it's a win-win, right? They don't have to lose the land or have the land degraded, They can keep all their traditional practices, all of their cultural identity, but still have an additional income from ecotourism. And now you might be thinking, yeah, but like how much is ecotourism going to pay compared to logging? Well, here's the clincher with that. Logging will pay you a lot one time. Then the forest is gone. Ecotourism will pay you a little bit for a long time. So these are decisions that as people, it's hard for us to make, right? Sometimes we want the immediate payoff. We need something now, now, now. But if communities can have enough foresight to understand that a community-based conservation setup could work better for them and give a smaller payoff, but for a longer time, then these can often be really successful. So here's some of the benefits that can be reaped if these work out. As I said, an alternative income source, economic benefits to the community through tourism, research, ranger jobs, clarification of land ownership. So I have previously mentioned that the only way that people in the Solomon Islands and many other places can get the title to their land formalized is by selling it to like a large multinational timber or other extractive corporation. But that through this process, NGOs can help them navigate that paperwork and get land ownership. So now they have more secure land tenure. Nobody can take that. The state can't come in and say, this isn't your land, we're going to log it or we're going to turn it into a railroad. It belongs to them now in the Western system. It already belonged to them in their cultural traditional system. Okay, and these community-based conservation allows traditional land management to continue. So if people are already living on and with the land and have done so for thousands of years and the land is still there and the biodiversity is still high, that's working, right? So let's keep that biocultural diversity. Let's not keep people out of the parks. Let's let people use the land the way they always did. But at the same time, not let any individual person sell out to for a short-term payoff. Okay, so quick example, and then you're done. This example is a Community Conservation Association on one of the islands in the Solomon Islands. So here's the Solomon Islands again. Here's this island. It's a super cool looking volcanic island. See how it's a circle? It's like a volcano erupted out of the ocean and made this island. It's not like that. That's what happened. In fact, if you want to see an island being born, there's some cool videos of islands being born, and they're all in this region where there's a lot of volcanic activity and new landforms are still forming. So it's really beautiful. Here's the landscape here in this other picture. It has 30,000 hectares of cloud to coast forest. That means there's forest conservation right up from the peak of the volcano all the way down to the ocean's edge. And when you have a lot of variation in altitude, that also means a lot of variation in what animals and plants can live there. So there's spectacular biodiversity. And it is increasingly threatened by logging, like you can see in that picture down there. And look at the size of some of those trees. Actually, I think those are barrels or something. But there are trees that size to be logged in the rainforest. So the Kolombangara CCA formed when actually the American Museum of Natural History came in and said, we would like to help you protect your forests and your culture by forming a CCA, the Community Conservation Association. And so the American Museum of Natural History, what they wanted was they were like, okay, well, we will give you some amount of money per year to kind of lease this section of land for biological research. And we want you to build a lodge, and we'll send researchers to stay there to do their research, and you can have tourists there too. And the land will be protected, but you can still use it for your traditional, for, you know, even cutting down trees as you did regularly, hunting, foraging, looking for medicines or anything else that you traditionally did in the forest. And then they also, one of the interesting things is they also worked with this Kolombangara Forest Products Limited. So that's a logging company. And they're part of this CCA because they committed to have more sustainable logging, not clear cut, but just some high value trees in certain areas of the reserve, and that adds more income to the reserve in general. So this particular project has been working really well. The community, you can see them down here in this picture. This is a community meeting. There's some people from the American Museum of Natural History there, some people from the logging company. The local community members receive a stipend payment from the reserve that reflects the benefits that come into the reserve from the lodge and from the timber company. Everyone receives the same stipend, but then some people also have jobs at the lodge or in tourism in the town. And here's like a picture of bird watching, so to represent ecotourism. So here's a situation where biocultural diversity is preserved. So these things are possible. And there's one important message I want you to take away from this class is that I didn't want this whole class to be just kind of a sob story about how we're losing biodiversity. I want you to learn actual skills for what we can potentially do to stop that. And this type of political association is a really important tool that can be used in a lot of the Earth's biodiversity hotspots. So that's all for today. On Monday, I will post the exam review sheet before class. And then, as I said, the class will be a live Zoom session, and I'll record it for people who can't attend. So thank you for listening today, and I hope you guys have a great weekend. Okay.